they built, and for a while they used it for a school too, as well as being a church. That's where when Aunt Pro taught, she taught, they had 2 rooms. She taught one class, and then there was a man that taught the other. We got pictures of them, that Mother had in the pictures.
And you'll have to get in with the names.
Grandpa, he was acting as a preacher a lot of the time. They went to church, and they loved to sing, and they were all good singers. And there were several families, and Grandma said that on Sundays they got to where, well, after church they'd all go to her house because she didn't live very far from the church. So they'd all go to their house for Sunday dinner, and then she said finally that got kind of old, having people every Sunday for dinner, and quite a few of them, So they got to where they'd just take their dinner and take their horse feed, and they'd stay for dinner. So that's why then they had dinner at church in the afternoon. So they got to where they'd go stay all day and have church in the morning, and then dinner, and then church again in the afternoon, and then go home. And that's where Mother went to school too, when she was a girl. And she always wished that she'd gone to college like Aunt Pearl did. See, Aunt Pearl went to college and she went to high school, and Aunt Maudie always said that Mother would take Aunt Pearl on Monday morning. She'd hitch up the horse and take Aunt Pearl in the cabin. She'd stay till Friday night, and Mother'd go back and get her. And Aunt Maudie always said that wasn't fair. Said Lily took Pearl, and then nobody took Lily. But and Mother always wished too that she had gone to college like Aunt Pearl had, and it would have been nice for her, I'm sure. And Grandpa, 100 years ago, because Aunt Annie, I wrote it down in the cookbook. Aunt Annie told me I was working on the cookbook, so I just wrote it in the cookbook that day Aunt Annie was there, and she said it was in 1885 that Grandpa's family came up over where Wilton lives, and that was their home. But then his parents and grandparents must have come too, because Viola Woolley told me here a while back that she knew where her Grandpa's mother and father and his grandmother and grandfather were buried. He said it wasn't very far from kind of out there in the old home community. And his Grandpa's grandfather's grave stone said, "Now you go home and dry your tears. I'll rest in peace till Christ appears." And I thought that was a little different epitaph, And hers then said, "Remember, friends, as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, soon you will be. Prepare for death and follow me." And that's been a long, long time ago, since they were put out there. And Grandma and Grandpa were the first 2 buried in that cemetery. And they always said that Grandpa's father and mother, his father and his mother, were the first 2 that were buried in another cemetery, and it was full by the time, that Grandma and Grandpa were gone. So, and they were both buried just inside the gate, because they were the first people to be buried there, in the cemetery. So they put them right inside the gate. And him and Grandma were like his mother and father. They were buried just inside the gate of the cemetery. Well, now I can tell you more about the Matthews. Well, I could tell you who Grandma's brothers and sisters were.
Okay, so you tell us more about the Carmichals then?
Yes, I'll just tell you a little more about the Carmichals.
I think it's interesting, too, Aunt Pearl, about
Their names.
great-grandpa starting the church because of his healing.
Yes, he had something, paralysis or something, and he couldn't work for a long time. And he'd hired some boys to do the farming, and he said that they'd farm just at the edge of just plow the corn back a little ways, and then they didn't plow it clear through the field. They just plowed it back a little ways because they knew he couldn't see it. And when the Deckards came there, and they were evangelists, and they just came through there, and that's how it happened that Grandpa built the church, was because after they came there and they prayed for him, and he got over his paralysis and could go on, and then was well and could do his work and everything, and then he built the church. And he wasn't a preacher up until then, and that's why he got enough religion that he could be the preacher himself. And they took all their boys and girls, they raised all their family in the church. And there were several others, lots more people in the community. They had so many people that they were friends, and that when we'd go down there, we'd go to ones for dinner, and we'd go to another ones for dinner the next day. All friends that Mama had known when she was a girl growing up. And they were all I guess people had to depend on each other a lot then, you know, and that's why they had lots of friendship. And Grandma and Grandpa, they traveled around quite a bit for people in their day, you know, that had 10 children and lived back in the hills of Arkansas. And Grandma and Grandpa went to the World's Fair. And Mother had a little fan for years and years that was a souvenir that they had brought back. And Grandmother said that the Barkers would say, you know, the fellows that talked on a box, soapbox or something, they'd say, ladies, lift up your skirts. You know, everybody's skirts dragged the floor. Ladies, lift up your skirts. You're picking up all the filth of the streets. Said, lift your skirts up a little higher. Don't pick up all the dirt in the streets. And that was where the ice cream cone was born. That's when they...
So this was the St. Louis World Fair.
St. Louis World's Fair, yeah. But that was quite a trip for them. You know, somebody had to take them to the train and go back to the train and get them the day they came home. And some lady, Mrs. Woods, stayed and took care of the children while Grandma and Grandpa were gone. She stayed with the kids and looked after them, you know.
And what were your Grandma and Grandpa's names?
Well, Grandma was Emma Nora. They always called her Nora. Emma Nora Williamson. And his was James Wesley Allen. And Joseph and Carol named Allen James Wesley. Wasn't it James Wesley?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. They named him James Wesley after Grandpa Carmichal. And Grandma's mother, she was kind of unfortunate. She was the oldest of the family, a big family, however, and she got two family names, Turntime McKibben. And she never liked it. And the grandkids always thought it was kind of funny that her name was Turntime McKibben. Well, the niece's nephews called her Aunt Tiny. That was her. But see, she was named for, it was two family names, Turntime and McKibben. And that's what they called her. And of course, she never liked it, naturally. And she was kind of spunky. And Mother said one time, I imagine Grandma had a new baby. And she'd been up there and stayed several days with the family. And one afternoon, she decided, well, it was time to go home. So Grandpa said, well, he'd just saddle a horse for her to ride home. And Mother said the kids always thought it was so funny that he saddled a horse and hitched it up to the back gate, you know, where she could get on and ride off. And said she looked out there and says, "Oh, that old slow thing." And they thought that was so funny that Grandma would want a fast horse. And Grandma didn't think she was that old, you know. But the kids laughed about that several times. Grandma said, "Oh, that old slow thing." She didn't like that one. Let me see. But Mother's sisters and brothers, Aunt Florence was first, and Mother was the second. And then, let me see, Mother was the second, and Aunt Pearl was the third, and Uncle Hoyt, and Aunt Maudie, and Aunt Annie, and Uncle John, and Aunt Lois, and then they lost two little boys when they were small, so there was 10 of the children altogether. And now Aunt Annie is the only one living, and she's not very well. She's 85, though. Aunt Pearl lived longer than anybody else. She lived to be 88, and of course she had cancer. And then Aunt Maudie married Dwight Huffman, and Dwight and our dad, Dwight's father, and our dad was first cousins. Their grandma and grandpas were brother and sisters. I know that, let's see, Dwight's grandma, and Aunt Melindy Huffman was Dwight's grandmother, and Solomon David Huffman was Dad's dad, so their folks were brother and sister. Let me see, what else do I have here?
You go back long enough on one side of the family,
Oh.
they carried scalpel knives.
Yes, Grandpa's mother was a half Indian. Her name was Laura Starnes, and her father was a chief of a Cherokee tribe. They were Cherokee Indians, and they were chief of the Cherokee tribe. And Wilton told us that when they were going on the way to Oklahoma. You know, when they drove the Indians out to Oklahoma, and they were on their way to Oklahoma, and they were going to Covered Wagon. And when they got over on the road where Wilton's house is, right there, this Covered Wagon broke the axle on it. Well, it took a long time to get that fixed. So they told the rest of the crew to go on, and they'd stay, and they did, and that's how come that they wound up right there. And of course, Grandpa owned the land where Wilton lives. He owned the ground where Aunt Annie's house is. And he had, when he passed away, each one of his children had 40 acres of land. And Uncle John got the whole home place. That's where our mother grew up. There was where Uncle John lives. But she was born in a log cabin over where Wilton is. And I guess that's probably the log cabin that her grandparents probably built, 100 years ago. And then when Grandpa moved over there and built a new house, why, Mother grew up there. She was just a year or two old when they moved over there. But, let's see. Well, I told about the Indians, didn't I? I don't know. Well, now we'll talk some about the Matthews family. One of the little stories that Dad used to tell us, and always in February, about Lincoln's birthday, he would tell us this little story about how his grandfather, somebody had come and bought a hog from him. And he was to take the hog to the stockyards in Springfield and leave it. Well, that was a long trip to take a hog from Cornland to Springfield. But he drove a horse and drove the hog to the stockyards. And on the way, he met Lincoln. And Pop always said, and then Grandpa would say, "Hire you Abe," and Abe would say, "Hire you Glover," because that was his grandfather's name. And he told him, where he was going and what. Naturally, he was going to take the hog to the stockyards and leave it for this man. And when the man got there to get it, well, the hog was gone. Probably somebody had taken it, or it had got out or something. Anyway, the hog was gone. And they had a trial, and then Lincoln was his witness that he did take the hog to the stockyards. So Dad always thought that was a real good little piece of history. And Dad was born in Midland. Some of his older brothers and sisters were born at Cornland, but he was born at Midland, and that's where Grandma and Grandpa lived. And as long as they lived, they stayed there lived there at the old home in Midland. And years later, a man was building a fire and had to clean up some brush around it in the place, and he caught it on fire, and he burned up, and the house burned down too. So we always hated that because that was just a little bit of history, And of course, we would run in and out of their house. Grandma and Grandpa was an awful lot, and we all hated it when the house was gone. And Grandma could tell more stories. She was a wonderful storyteller, and she always told us that's how family history was handed down. Was people, and some of her family were good storytellers because she knew all the old time things that happened, and she could tell you some wonderful stories. And she told one thing. She said that during the cholera epidemic, people would get that, and they just die in just a few hours. And she said if they were in a wagon going someplace, and some of the family died, they couldn't continue to take them home because the big cats followed the wagons, and they had to stop right there and bury their dead, and then go on without them. She said that was such a tragedy for the families, And Grandma told us the story about how her older brothers were in the Civil War. Well, Grandma Carmichael's father was fought for the South, and Grandma's Matthews family fought for the North. And Grandma had several brothers to go to war, and when the oldest brother went that morning, why, they all stood around and told him goodbye. And when he was gone, she came back in the house and went in the bedroom and cried because he hadn't told her especially goodbye. There was several there to tell goodbye, and she felt so bad about that. And pretty soon he decided he didn't want the hat he took, he wanted a cap. So he came back to get the cap. Of course, they had to just walk off, that's the way they went. And he came back to get his cap, and they told him, said, "She's in there crying because she didn't tell you goodbye." So he told her that he just came back to tell her goodbye. He didn't tell her that he came to get his hat, And that was the last time she ever saw him. Of course, Grandma could always tell us how wicked the South was, and we heard the other side from our own mothers that the North was just as bad as the South was. But Grandma had two brothers that were taken. They were taken captive. They were taken by the South, and Dad said they didn't have anything to eat for so long. They didn't have any food to give them. And when he got out, he ate with the hog somewhere. I don't know whether it was corn or what he ate, and said it killed him. And so that was Uncle Joe. That was her oldest brother, was Uncle Joe. And then she had other brothers that were in the service. And I think one of them came out of, he was an officer. Uncle John Jones was an Army officer when he came home. But it was a colorful time, you know, during the time that they lived. And Grandma Matthews, I don't know whether it was her grandfather or her great-grandfather, but David Roan could tell us because he's found in the library in Springfield that one of Grandma's grandfathers was the first school teacher in DeWitt County. And you know where Hallsville is?
No, I don't.
Don't you know when you go on Route 10 from Lincoln to Clinton?
Yeah.
And it said there's a little place there that says Kenny off to the south on the road. Well, right there was on the east side of the road that goes to Kenny. It was where the first schoolhouse was in the county. And for years and years, Aunt Esther taught. There was a schoolhouse, Hallville School, just across the street, just across the road from that. And she taught there for years and years. And before I was old enough to go to school, almost 70 years ago, I went there to visit school with her when she drove a horse and buggy. So, you know, we go back a long way. We can remember lots of things like that, you know, that took place. And the schoolhouse, well, if they had activities at school, that was the biggest event, you know, in the winter, if you could go to the schoolhouse and have a Christmas party or, you know, have a program. And when she taught there, Oliver was just a little boy, I expect about like Marilyn's little boy. And of course, Dad was Santa Claus, and he went to him and Oliver just scared him to death. He didn't know what to think of Santa Claus. He didn't like that at all. He didn't know it was his own dad, you know. But it was kind of nice little things to remember. And Midland, when Dad grew up there, it was a high school, and they called it Midland City Business School. And people graduated there. They could go teach school. They could work in banks. They could do all kinds of jobs, you know, almost like having a college education now. But if you went through Midland City School, and Harold Matthews said one time he showed his dad a picture of the Midland School and thought his dad wouldn't know what it was. And he said to him, Dad, you know what that is? And he says, well, I sure do. That's MCBS. And he says, what's MCBS? He said, Midland City Business School. So, you know, it was respected, and people went from there to big jobs. And Dad's sisters, you know, 3 of them taught school. And Lucy, Aunt Susie, and Aunt Esther. Of course, Aunt Esther taught longer than the others. And Aunt Esther's children all got college educations, you know, all 5 of them, except the oldest one. He didn't want to go to school. But the other 2, you know, David is a professor at Stevens Point, Wisconsin, and that Jimmy, the youngest one, was well, he taught school at a school near New York, someplace over east, where the rich people, sent their children, and you had to be very, very careful who taught there and who came and went, you know. And then after that, he went to the Import-Export Bank in Washington, D.C. and worked there. And she used to kind of laugh and say that Ethel Kennedy was their neighbor because they went by her house every night going home, you know. And then the girl, she is a speech therapist. And the last we heard from her, her say that she had a better job. She was going around teaching speech therapy to the therapists going all over the country. And somebody said, why would you do that? And she said, for all that money. So I guess she had a good salary, you know. Anyway,
That was Sharon's reason, anyway.
For all that money.
Now, what were great-grandma and grandpa Matthews' names?
Grandma Matthews was Hester Fidelia Jones. And her mother and father are buried at a little country cemetery, Old Union. And it's not very far from Kenny, is Old Union Cemetery. And Grandpa had married Grandma's sister. And Annie and Alice told me this story later. But you know, from their mother, they got a lot of things that your dad never thought to tell you. But they said, well, I know Grandma had land, Larry Midland. She owned some land. And they said that Alice was, her sister Alice was older than Fidelia. So Grandpa and Grandma were going to get married. Solomon and Fidelia were going to get married. Well, they hated for the second girl. They were English. And they didn't think the second girl should get married ahead of the older girl. So they told Grandma if she let Alice have Grandpa, that they'd give her 40 acres of land.
Oh my!
So that's why Grandma had the land. And after Grandpa and Alice were married, and they had 3 children anyway. I kind of think there was 4, and I lost a baby. I think that was it. But anyway, they had 3 little children, and she died. And then after that, Grandma and Grandpa were married. Then he married Bedelia, see. And he was going to marry her in the first place, but Alice was the oldest, so she gave, how that all worked out.
Children.
Huh?
The older children.
Uncle Gilbert,
Yeah.
and Aunt Susie, and Aunt Lucy. And then there was Pop, and Aunt Mame, and Aunt Esther. Was that it? I guess. But that was why Grandma had the land, and I never could quite figure that out, you know. And I know that and then Grandma had one sister that was younger than she was, and she lived there in Midland, Aunt Nan Robbins, and she lived to be 86. She hasn't been dead too many years. And her youngest son died, about 20 years ago, I think it was, in 65. And he died the day before Christmas. He lived in Clinton. And he had some nieces and nephews, but they never could locate them. And so Anna Landreth and I were the 2 relatives. Well, he was the first cousin to our mother and dad. And so we went to the funeral, and before the funeral, the undertaker had us go back in another room, and he had a little bit of money, and we had to sign a check to pay for his funeral expenses out of that little bit of money that he had in there. But they didn't, nobody even knew when he was born. They didn't, because I looked the other night through a lot of things that I had, and there's those little things from the, memorials. And it said he was born in Kansas, but it didn't say when. I'm sure they didn't know when he was born, But it's strange that he wouldn't have told somebody how old he was or something like that, but nobody knew how old he was.
So was he Aunt Nan's only?
They had lived in Indiana all their married life. They lived. And she, when she died, he wanted to bury her there on the home place. Well, her brothers wanted her brought back to Illinois to be buried with her mother. And when they got out there, there was a big crowd went to the funeral. Went from Iowa, and they went from Illinois and Arkansas. They went everywhere because she was so well known and so well loved. And when they got out there and found out that he wasn't going to bring her back to Illinois, some of her brothers got so mad that they left. They wouldn't even stay for the funeral. They didn't like that at all. But that's where they had planned to be buried because his family was buried there, So that was where they buried. It was back in a field, but they just didn't like that at all. Said bury in a field. Well, when lots of other families used to do that, these little cemeteries are all over the country. You can tell that they were family plots, and they were buried there. And let me see, I was going to tell something else about that. Well, Wayne and I went there one time, or twice. We took Aunt Pearl and Mother too one time.
Yeah.
So we've been back out there 2 times to the cemetery.
The first time was stayed with some of the family, and it's the only time in our life we slept in a log cabin. You couldn't tell it had been plastered over and weatherboarded on the outside, but it was part of the original old log cabin.
The Deckard home.
And Sister Annie Deckard, now how was she related to Dwight Huffman?
Well, she was Dwight's dad's sister. That was Aunt Melindy. Aunt Melindy had 10 children too, and she was one of Aunt Melindy's children. And Bill Huffman, his father was named Connor, and he was one of her brothers too, and they were all Aunt Melindy's children. And when Grandpa and Aunt Melindy's father was a young man, and his children were small, that was during the time of the cholera epidemic, and he had took a sack of corn over to Mechanicsburg to have it ground into cornmeal. And on the way, he met some man and talked to him, like people do. And the man had cholera, and they didn't know it. And when he got home, the next day he died, and 2 or 3 of his children died. And they couldn't bury him. They couldn't take him down the road even then. They wouldn't dare take anybody down the road. So they buried him and the family in the orchard. And that place is still there too. It's over toward Cornland. It's out on the Cravens farm. Wasn't it Cravens? And I don't know. There's several graves there in this little. It's just out in a pasture, but there's several stones still out in the pasture. And when I went to get my DAR membership, we had to go there and take pictures of this stone so that we'd have proof. You know, that's all the proof we had. That far back, and then his mother or grandmother was, his grandmother had been in the Revolutionary War. You know, she was an army nurse during 1776 when she was with Washington's Army at Valley Forge, and you can find that in the history books in Springfield too.
Do you remember what her name was?
Luann McDonald, and her husband was Robert McDaniel. And they wasn't married at the time. While she was still young, single, she went into the service, you know, as an army nurse. And he then spent 4 years in the Continental Army. And after he got out, they got married. And then he died there. But she came back to Illinois with 4 of her sons. And she is buried at Mechanicsburg. And we thought we went over one time and just wanted to see if we could find her grave. Well, it wasn't hard to find. There were 3 markers on her grave. There was the one the family had put there, the family gravestone, and then there was one that the Army put there because she served in the Army, and there was a DAR marker because she'd been a DAR member. Some DAR member had put a stone there. So her grave is very well marked in the cemetery. So it makes you feel kind of proud, you know. And there's not very many people, women, that were ever in the service. And so I feel kind of honored that I have 2 ancestors. Of course, some people have traced theirs back, they've got a dozen or more, you know. But I have the 2 that I can go back on, and one of them is a woman, and that is very rare that anybody finds a woman that has been was in the Revolutionary War. So it all, you know, even though it's kind of nice to be able to go back and see what your ancestors have done and things like that, and to be in the DAR, there can't be any illegitimacy or anything like that in the family. And I thought, well, our family sure made us proud of them all the way back. You know, you could trace them back, and everybody had been up.
School out or anything, he never missed a formation for that entire time.
He was a cavalry. That was Grandpa Williamson. He was in the cavalry. That was Civil War, though. That wasn't Revolutionary. That was the Civil War. But this man had written up a real nice eulogy and an article, you know, it's a full page, and told all about him in the war, and told who he'd married, and all about his family and everything like that. So he'd known all the family, and I thought that was kind of nice. She found it someplace. Somebody had gotten a hold of it, and she made a copy and sent one to us.
Now, who was it that sent it?
Irma sent it.
Then, Uncle Wayne, did you have stories about your family in the Revolutionary War? Is that?
No.
Well,
The only thing about them in the Revolutionary War, what up was a Haitian soldier.
well, now, on the mother's side, that's your dad's side.
Yes, that's my dad's side. My mother's side, I don't really know when they showed up here in the States.
Well, you had a grandfather that was in the Revolutionary War, though.
Well, yeah. Well, I'll get this straight. Got to make a real interesting picture. Oh, there's on my mother's side of the family, my great-grandmother was named Abraham Lincoln. And my great-grandmother's folks lived up here on 136, just east of where you turn to go to Forest City, about a half mile. And Lincoln stopped there to stay overnight as he's gone to court in Pekin. And he said if she's a girl, name her Mary Adeline. That's how come my great-grandmother was named Mary Adeline. And Lincoln was a cousin to my great-grandmother's father. And he had at one time been at New Salem, and one of the cabins down there, kind of a lean-to on the back, says Ferguson's Leather Shop. And that was him. He's buried north of Petersburg, the little cemetery, I believe the name is Concord. There's no stone or anything, but there's a county record that he is buried there.
So this would be your great-great-grandfather.
Yes.
And we have a dish. This is kind of a coincidence. We have had a pretty little dish that Wayne's aunt had given to us and said it had been Wayne's grandmother's. So he's got a cousin that's pretty naive, and she walked over to our house one day and saw a dish, and we said we thought it had been Wayne's mother's. And we said that dish had been Wayne's mother's. She said, "Oh no!" So that was Aunt Lizzie's. That had been Wayne's great aunt. She says, "Well, I knew their dishes as well as I knew my own." So I got down to one, and I said, "Was this Wayne's grandmother's?" And she said, "No, that was his great-grandmother's." And that was the woman that Lincoln had named, see? So we've got one of her bowls. And we were real glad she told us that because we didn't, and Wayne's folks didn't know it either, you know. She had, I guess they'd never seen the one that Aunt Lillian gave us, you know.
No. Well, my mother died when I was 6, so I didn't get much from that side of the family, you know. And my great-grandfather List came from Germany. He'd been an officer in the German army. A horse threw him, broke a bunch of bones, and he was never too good after that. And they taught him to be a cobbler, and he came to the United States, and his wife and 2 of her sisters, all 3 families, settled right down the road west of Washington, 80 acres each side by side. Now, kind of scattered the List name around. My grandfather, or my great-grandfather's family, there was 8, and they was all boys. And
Well, there's our boys anyway.
yes, and I don't know of anything more that's really interesting about that side of the family, but
Well, one time grandmother used to send packages, you know, from Arkansas, and it was always nice to get a package from grandmother. And among the things she sent was a little hat that somebody had, it wasn't a new hat, it was a little hat. Your dad got it and put it on, he says, "My old everyday." And he'd always wear that for every day. That was his old everyday hat.
and the reason my great-grandparents settled there between Washington and Peoria, they was just settling that country then, and that was in 1840 or 41. And Peoria was a little enough town yet then they staked their cows out.
Look, anyway, I X P X and IP.